What really happened to German soldiers after World War II? The untold post-war story. The question echoes through the ruins of a defeated empire. May 8, 1945. Berlin is silent, burned black by years of relentless battle. Across Europe, more than 8 million German soldiers lay down their arms as the Third Reich collapses. Entire divisions stop fighting in a single afternoon. The once feared Wehrmacht, the army that had marched across the continent, now marches into captivity. But what happened next was not the end. For many, it was only the beginning of a new struggle, one without glory, one without weapons, one fought for survival. Some were taken by the Americans, fed, processed, and released within months. Others were seized by the British or French and forced into hard labor to rebuild nations torn apart by war. But the harshest fate awaited those captured by the Soviet Union. Tens of thousands vanished behind barbed wire and into the icy gulags of the East, where death waited in the snow. And beyond captivity came the trials, Nuremberg, denazification, and a reckoning that would define the shape of the new world. This is the untold story of what happened after the war ended. A story of consequences, judgment, survival, and rebirth. Because while the guns fell silent in May 1945, for millions of German soldiers, the war was far from over. When the Reich collapsed, Germany had over 17 million men who had served in uniform between 1939 and 1945. More than 7.6 million were still alive when the war ended. They came from every branch. The Wehrmacht here, field armies stretched thin from Norway to Italy. The Luftwaffe, grounded and running out of fuel. The Kriegsmarine, whose U-boats had been hunted to extinction. And the Waffen-SS, the ideological elite units that Allied commanders considered particularly dangerous. By early 1945, most German units were shattered. Divisions that once fielded 15,000 men were reduced to 1,500. Weapons were scarce. Vehicles were gone. The once formidable Wehrmacht had been pushed into pockets of resistance. The Ruhr Pocket, the Courland Pocket, the remnants of Army Group Vistula fighting desperately around Berlin. When the surrender came, it was absolute. German soldiers were no longer combatants, they were disarmed enemy forces. The Allies, however, did not treat every prisoner the same. The American zones. The U.S. Army captured more than 3.4 million German soldiers. For them, surrender often meant a quick intake process, temporary camps, and then transfer to more permanent facilities in France or the United States. Many would be released by late 1946. The British zones. The British held around 3 million. Many POWs were put to work rebuilding bombed-out cities, clearing rubble, repairing roads, or working farms. The French zones. France, devastated by German occupation, used POW labor extensively. Many German soldiers were forced into rebuilding bridges, railways, and mines. Some would remain in captivity until 1948 to 1949. The Soviet zone. But the Soviet Union held the darkest chapter. The Red Army captured an estimated 2.8 to 3.3 million Germans. For them, captivity could mean starvation, disease, forced labor camps, and years of uncertainty. More than 1 million German POWs died in Soviet custody, the highest death rate among all Allied nations. Not all German soldiers went into captivity. Thousands tried to flee westward to surrender to the Americans instead of the Soviets. Some succeeded, many didn't, and as they filed into camps across Europe, a new fear rose among them. By the summer of 1945, nearly 8 million German soldiers had surrendered to the Western Allies. The men who expected death instead found themselves facing an uncertain future, one shaped by camps, interrogations, starvation, and hard labor. Across U.S., British, and French zones, camps varied widely. Some were humane, others were brutal. A few became infamous. And for the millions of young Wehrmacht soldiers, the nightmare was far from over. U.S. POW camps, order, interrogations, and the unknown. On May 10, 1945, the first major wave of German prisoners arrived at the massive camp at Heidelberg, soon followed by thousands at Bad Aibling, Regensburg, and Rheinberg. The U.S. Army called them disarmed enemy forces, DEFs. a category created so Geneva Convention protections did not fully apply. Inside the wire, conditions depended on location. Some camps issued sufficient rations. Others were overwhelmed, lacking tents, water, and medical facilities. Many soldiers slept in open fields, exposed to rain and cold. Interrogation centers, like Fort Hunt, P.O. Box 1142, extracted intelligence. Far from home, with no idea of their family's fate, fear gripped the men. Not from bullets anymore, but from starvation, disease, and uncertainty. British POW camps, discipline, rations, and forced labor. In the British sector, particularly around Hamburg, Schleswig-Holstein, and Lower Saxony, camps were more structured but strict. German POWs were used for clearing rubble, rebuilding bridges and roads, harvesting crops, cleaning unexploded ordnance, collecting bodies from ruined cities. By August 1945, the British had over 3 million German soldiers under their control. Food shortages hit the UK hard, so British authorities fed POWs only at wartime civilian levels. It wasn't cruelty, it was necessity. But it meant hunger became constant. A few camps, including Wahlberlin, became dangerously overcrowded. French POW camps, the hardest rebuilding work. France had been devastated by German occupation. In 1945, anger remained raw, villages leveled, civilians executed, cities destroyed. So when France received 750,000 German POWs, conditions were harsher. The French faced criticism for using POWs in mines, forest-cutting brigades, dam and canal construction, rebuilding factories, clearing collapsed buildings. At Camp de Thory, hunger and disease were rampant. At Écrouves, hundreds died during the winter of 1945–46. And yet, many German POWs later admitted that France gave them a strange gift: purpose. Civilians often worked alongside them. Meals were shared. Stories exchanged. Some POWs stayed in France, married French women, and never returned to Germany. The psychological collapse, millions of men, no future. By late 1945, the harshest reality set in. Most German soldiers had no idea where their families were, if their homes still existed, if their wives or children were alive, when or if they would ever be released. Some camps saw suicide rates spike. A few men lost their sanity. Others clung to routines, polishing boots, shaving with broken glass, drilling themselves, simply to stay human. The turning point in the West, release and return, 1946 to 1948. The Western Allies realized they could not hold millions forever. By June 1946, the U.S. began large-scale releases. Britain followed, accelerating releases into 1947. France freed POWs more slowly, not ending forced labor until 1948. On July 31, 1948, the final French-held POW boarded a train home. The war was over. Now came the second battle, rebuilding a shattered nation. The turning point, from soldiers to civilians. When millions of former soldiers returned to Germany, they did not come home to the country they had fought for. Instead, they stepped into cities turned to ashes, families scattered, factories in ruins, food shortages everywhere. No government, no jobs, no nation. What happened next would become one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history. The Hunger Years, 1945 to 1948. It was called Die Hungerjahr. In bombed-out cities like Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, and Essen, families lived in cellars, burned-out apartments, makeshift shelters, rubble-filled streets. Former soldiers collected bricks from ruins to rebuild homes. Rations were as low as 1,000 calories per day. Starvation levels. Black markets exploded. Many ex-soldiers traded medals, uniforms, watches, army boots, just to get bread. Some turned to crime, others to despair. But many, perhaps most, simply worked, rebuilding the nation brick by brick. Former Wehrmacht soldiers provided the majority of the physical labor that rebuilt early post-war Germany. They cleared 400 million cubic meters of rubble, rebuilt thousands of bridges, restored water and power systems, reopened rail lines and factories, restarted steel plants in the Ruhr, constructed the first post-war homes and schools. In Berlin alone, over 60,000 former soldiers worked daily removing debris. These weren't proud moments. They were necessary ones. Joining the new police forces and border guards. By 1946 to 49, Western powers needed order inside Germany. Thousands of former soldiers were recruited into Deutsche Polizei, German police, border protection units, railway security, rural gendarmerie. Why? Because they had discipline, weapons training, leadership experience. For many, it was the first step into a normal life. War crimes trials, justice and fear. Between 1945 and 1949, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were screened. Most were cleared, but thousands, especially SS men, faced Nuremberg, Dachau trials, British Ravensbrück trials, Soviet NKVD courts. For ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers, fear remained constant. Will I be accused? Did my surrender documents survive? Will someone blame me for something I didn't do? Many lived with that fear for decades. The Wirtschaftswunder, former soldiers, and the economic miracle. In 1948, the Western Allies introduced the Deutsche Mark. Factories reopened. Trade restarted. Farm production increased. Former soldiers became engineers, truck drivers, steel workers, construction managers, machinists, policemen, civil servants, teachers, business owners. Between 1948 to 1952, millions of veterans helped fuel the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. By 1950, Germany was rising faster than anyone expected. Resolution and legacy. What became of the German soldiers? So, what really happened to the German soldiers after World War II? Their story is not one event, but many paths. Some died in Soviet captivity. Thousands never returned from the Gulag. Millions survived US, British, and French camps. Some suffered. Some were treated fairly. Most endured uncertainty. Millions more returned to a homeland in ruins. They rebuilt it brick by brick. A few faced justice for crimes. Most were cleared. All lived with the weight of history, and nearly all of them carried scars, physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives. What they created afterward, peace, stability, and economic growth, is a legacy rarely acknowledged. But it is real, and it shaped modern Europe. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Files as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.